This is the start of book 3 in the Reina series. The name of the book is Waves, and this is part 1, chapter 1. No words could ever explain how I felt as I stood there in his arms. It was as if everything in my life before this moment was only a sketch, penciled onto paper without a drop of color or detail. Now the lines were filled in with brilliant colors. The smells were so intense, and even the air smelled different. It was amazing, and yet that word seemed to be lacking. Was there a word that could possibly describe this? Eay-o-tay, he whispered in my ear, and I smiled. Yeah, that seemed to be the only word that could sum it up. The ancient werewolf word that had no true translation. But now, Phil and I understood its meaning. The others could only say that it meant true love, but even they admitted it went much deeper than that, and it did. I sighed softly, still standing there, my cheek against his chest. I not only heard his heart beating, I felt it inside of me. It was as if there were 2 hearts pounding in my chest now. I closed my eyes and listened to them. Mine, of course, beat just a little slower than his. The vampire blood in my veins was the reason for the difference. No, vampires didn't have beating hearts. Pure vampires, that is, but I was a hybrid. I shifted between the worlds of both races, emotionally as well as physically. 3/4 vampire, 1/4 werewolf. I had beat the odds by not only actually shifting, but surviving the process. Most hybrids couldn't shift. Those that did rarely survived. This is amazing, he whispered, his voice shaking. I could only nod, still absorbing the sensations that raced through me. Then I heard another sound and lifted my head, keeping the rest of me against him. Until that very moment, I couldn't have told you where we even were. We could have been standing in a field or on a busy street. I didn't remember and didn't care. But when I turned towards the sound, I saw 5 faces staring at me, and I knew them. Ryan, our pack alpha, smiled, his eyes moist and his cheeks wet. Track, also a pack member and my best friend, stood next to him. His eyes were wide, and he wiped at them quickly, which made me smile. The others stood with their mouths open and a look of confusion and amazement on their faces. I knew them, and I loved them. They were part of my wolf pack, our wolf pack. Ryan took a step towards us, walking carefully, his eyes still wide with wonder and a bit of shock. I reached one hand out to him, keeping the other tucked against Phil. Our alpha swallowed hard and then took my hand. He gasped when he touched me, which made the others rush up. No, he shot back quickly, shaking his head, but keeping his eyes on me. His smile softened then, and his eyes watered more. That's the most amazing thing I have ever felt, he whispered, his voice shaking. I smiled as Track stepped up. Phil reached out and placed his hand on my best friend's arm. His eyes shot open and he shivered a little, a smile forming on his handsome face. Slowly, one by one, the other 3 stepped up and cautiously placed a hand on Phil's arm. Is that? Jackson gasped, and Ryan nodded, still watching me with an awe that didn't seem right on my alpha's face. I was always the one in awe of him. It seemed odd to have it be the other way around. How in the world? Jackson whispered in response. I have no idea, Ryan replied, with a slight laugh in his voice. Finally, their faces changed, just a bit, and they dropped their hands, but their eyes stayed on us. I felt happy for them and glad they were able to share this with us. Werewolf packs were extremely close, and this was something I would have regretted them not being a part of. Jackson shook his head. That was flippin' amazing, he laughed, looking down at his own hand. Rock nodded and Track grinned at me. Thanks. I smiled and nodded back. I knew what he meant. He shook his head and blew out a slow breath. I watched them all try to recover from what had just happened. When I looked up at Phil, he was smiling down at me. Every inch of his gorgeous face was imprinting in my mind now. If I closed my eyes, I could recall every detail. He lowered his head until our foreheads touched, and we stood there without saying a word, letting the sensation swim through us. Then, as always, the sound of a phone ringing broke the moment. It didn't matter. Whatever happened between him and me, it wasn't something that was going to fade, ever. Every part of me knew that. Jackson rushed into the other room, and Ryan finally walked over and sat on one of the two large beds. His brows rose higher, and he chuckled, running his hand through his hair. That was a sign that usually meant he was stressed or ticked, but with that smile on his face, I knew he was just still trying to sort out what he had felt. We all turned when Jackson came back in with a cell phone held out. Ryan took it and walked into the room Jackson had come from. So, are you all going to just stand there and stare at us? I finally chuckled. Probably, Rock smiled, and Jackson nodded. That was crazy awesome. I have never felt anything like that before. Rock shook his head. Leave it to Reina to bring legend to life. I giggled, and Phil's arms gave me a soft squeeze. So, are you two stuck like that, or what? Jackson finally said, rubbing his hand over his arm. Things were drifting back to normal, at least for them. My normal was here now, with Phil, and it was the most amazing feeling. I think we actually are, Phil teased, and Rock's smile dipped. Seriously? I giggled, and Rock shook his head. Phil leaned down and kissed my cheek, causing me to moan softly. I turned into him and was about to return the kiss when Rock made a comment about needing our own room. Vampires don't blush, but I stopped, and Phil winked at me and then straightened. I turned so that Phil was against my back, and he reached down and took my hand. My skin quivered at his touch, and I smiled, giving his hand a soft squeeze. Ryan walked back in, the phone still in his hand. He looked at Phil, then me, and shook his head. There seemed to be a lot of that going on. What happened? Track asked, stepping up to my side. Ryan shrugged, then shook his head. Not sure how to explain it, he stated, letting his eyes pass over all of us. It seems we weren't the only ones that felt what just happened. What does that mean? Rock asked, stepping up to the other side of us. I looked at him and then at Track, and realized they were taking a protective stance. Track a bit in front of me, and Rock just behind Phil's shoulder. It wasn't Ryan they were squaring off with, and from the looks on their faces, I don't think they even realized they did it. Ryan looked at the phone in his hand. That was David. Then he turned to Track. Your dad said that everyone, and I mean everyone, in the pack felt it. What the? Jackson gasped. They didn't know what it was, but it seems like... He shrugged again. David said that everyone felt some sort of rush or wave. Another shrug, and his free hand ran through his already tousled hair. Stopped them all dead in their tracks. Are they okay? Marcus asked, and we all looked his way, then looked back to Ryan. They're fine, he nodded, then gave a small chuckle. David said it was like having the best feeling in the world wash over you in an instant. All eyes turned back to us now, and I smiled. The pack felt it too, even the ones that weren't right here with us. I told him what happened, Ryan continued, tilting his head to crack his neck. Another habit. He put Elder Michael on the phone, and I had to retell every detail, best I could. He shook his head. Wasn't easy trying to put that into words. Everyone nodded their agreement. I smiled and leaned back against Phil's chest. Somehow, our pack got to be a part of this, and that made me very happy. Ryan's smile faded. He sighed and looked at me. Elder Michael wants to come here and talk to you two. Then he looked up at Phil. I leaned a little to the side and lifted my head and looked up at him too, not amazed that he looked gorgeous even from this odd angle. I felt Phil's body tighten a bit. After she has time to rest, he stated, as I started to get lost in his beautiful features. Ryan shook his head. They're on their way. Phil tensed and his jaw tightened. How was it that even that made him look hot? I chuckled, turned and patted his chest. I'm fine, I whispered up at him. He looked down at me and went to reply when we all heard a strange noise then and turned. Jackson shrugged, putting a hand on his stomach. Sorry, just suddenly very hungry. The others admitted the same, and Ryan dialed the number on the cell phone still in his hand. He looked at Phil as he put the phone to his ear. I better check on the ones outside. I'm sure they felt it too. As he talked to the rest of the pack members that had come with them, I took Phil's hand and walked to one of the beds, sitting on the edge. Track, Rock, and Jackson sat on one across from us, so we were all facing each other. I watched them for a few seconds and then smiled. Are you our private guards now? Track nodded, his face too serious. I think we are. When I rolled my eyes, Marcus stepped up. Thank you, he said to the two of us, for letting us all be a part of that, he added when we looked up at him. This was another time I was glad I couldn't blush. That's what Pack is all about, Phil replied. We're glad that you got to share that with us. I nodded quickly, smiling warmly at our newest member. Another phone rang, and Marcus went into the other room to get it. I yawned and put my hand over my mouth. You need to get some sleep, Phil stated, turning back to me. So do all of you, I chuckled. What time is it anyhow? With the blackout curtains pulled, I had no sense of time. It was a bit unnerving when you stopped to think about it. It's only 6, Track stated, then added p.m., and I nodded. My internal clock must be off. This is usually about the time I was getting up, but I yawned again. Let's let her hit the shower and freshen up, Ryan said, clicking off the phone and laying it on the long dresser that held the bolted-down TV. The thought of a hot shower made me smile. I loved showers. What about her side? Track asked, and I looked down at the slight lump under my shirt. Oh, yeah, that. I frowned and put my free hand over it. That buck had done a number on me, but shifting hadn't helped either. It didn't hurt much now, but I worried they would say a shower was out of the question. I had them bring some waterproof covering for it, Ryan explained. She'll be fine, and she certainly deserves it. I smiled up at him. Thank you. I could use a nice hot shower. He was a great alpha. He winked and then told Track to get my bag and put it in the bathroom. I stood up and Phil did the same. When I looked up at him, he nodded. I doubt this place has a very large hot water tank, but enjoy. When I let go of his hand, I smiled. There was no wave of panic or sadness. He was right here, and my heart knew that. I walked into the bathroom just as Track was carrying in another duffel bag. Ryan stepped up, holding a square envelope. This has a large waterproof cover, he stated. I took it, and then they both left. Once the bandage was in place, I quickly stripped off my clothes and walked into the shower. It was cramped, but I didn't care. The water was hot, and I stood under it, letting it wash over me. Showers were one of the best inventions, I thought, chuckling to myself. Track had packed my shampoo, conditioner, and even my soap. It was nice to be able to use my own things. The shower was short-lived. Phil was right about the hot water, but it was fabulous. When I stepped out, I was actually humming to myself. I stood at the fogged mirror, pointed the blow-dryer at it, and watched the fog disappear. After towel drying my hair, I picked up the brush and blow-dryer and finished the job. Finally, I grabbed my shirt, then realized I didn't have another bandage for my side. I looked in the bag, and not seeing another one, I just slipped my shirt on. Ryan, Phil, and Track were the only ones in the room when I walked out. The medical bag was on one of the beds, and I walked over, laid on my side on the bed, and lifted my shirt just enough. This was becoming far too routine. Ryan was the one that took the bandage off and started to put the salve on, but Phil and Track both watched closely. I pretended not to notice, or to feel like I was under a microscope. When the new bandage was in place, I pulled down my shirt and sat up. So, how's it healing? Good, our alpha smiled. A few days, and you should be good as new. He patted my leg and then stood, taking the wet dressing to the garbage can. Now you need to get some sleep, Phil stated, and I yawned in response. I went to stand, but he shook his head. You can sleep right here. My smile dipped a bit, but I nodded as he reached up and pulled down the bedding. I crawled up underneath. My nose wrinkled, and I wiggled a bit. What's wrong? Track asked as he stood by the bed. Sheets are scratchy, I admitted. He chuckled. Yeah, well, they were all out of 2,000 thread count when we asked. I rolled my eyes and Phil smiled at me. We won't be here much longer. We'll get you someplace more comfortable as soon as we can. When I laid my head on the pillow, he sat on the side of the bed looking down at me. Are you going to watch me fall asleep? I teased. If you want me to, he said with a wink. I chuckled and bit my lower lip. Part of me actually wanted him to. It felt so good to be close to him. Track was standing next to Phil, and I heard his stomach growl this time. I'll be fine. I know you guys have a lot to talk about, plus you need to eat, I ended, smiling at Track. My best friend chuckled, leaned over, and kissed my forehead. Get some sleep, wolf girl. When he walked out of the room, I rolled onto my back and looked up at Phil. You don't look like a mutant zombie, I said, smiling. His dimple showed when he smiled back. I'm glad to hear that. I shrugged. They said that you changed before. I was worried. Oh, that, he sighed, pulling the covers up under my chin. I didn't make mutant zombie status, but I wasn't the nicest person to be around, until about an hour ago. His brown eyes twinkled, but I frowned. I'm sorry that you had to go through all of that. Don't be, he whispered, still smiling. It was worth every second. My eyes drank him in for a minute, and then another yawn snuck out. My eyes widened, and I covered my gaping mouth. You get some sleep, he chuckled again, adjusting the blanket. I'll be right in the other room, and the door will be open, in case you need anything. He went to stand, and I reached out quickly and grabbed his hand. This thing that happened to us, it won't go away, will it? His soft ash blonde hair fell over his eyes a bit when he leaned over me. What does your heart tell you? My smile came back and I nodded. It would never go away. Then he leaned forward more and kissed my forehead. Now get some sleep. I have a feeling we're in for a very long night once the others show up. I watched him stand up and walk towards the door. He stopped then and turned, smiling at me. I grinned and rolled on my good side, completely content. As soon as I closed my eyes, I was asleep. When your body is done sleeping, but your mind doesn't want to let go of the dreams, you drift in a world somewhere in between. I was laying on the softest cloud, slowly floating through the air. It was warm and soft, and the contentment was amazing. Then something started to buzz in the back of my mind. My brows wrinkled as I realized that they were sounds, and I grumbled when the sounds became voices. A soft growl escaped, and I flipped onto my other side, not wanting to leave the peace. Unfortunately, a sharp pain did what the voices couldn't. I gasped and sat up, my hand going to my side. Then I cried out as the door, that was only partially open, was flung wide, hitting the plastic stopper on the wall behind it. Phil, Track, and Jackson rushed in. Rock and Marcus were right behind them, and they all rushed towards me. I put up my other hand quickly. I'm okay, I grunted. I just turned wrong. My head spun a little from waking up so quickly. Phil pulled back the blankets and sighed. You're bleeding. What? All I did was turn, I whimpered, looking down at my shirt. It's only a little blood, I said in my defense, which was true, even though it had quickly made its way through a pretty thick bandage. Ryan walked in then, and Jackson turned and told him. Great. I even wake up in trouble. Our alpha stepped up and looked down at my side. We'll clean that up and put a fresh bandage on it. All I did was turn over, I explained, frowning down at the shirt as if it had somehow betrayed me. He walked over, picked up the medical bag, and came back. Phil stood and moved around the other side of the bed. When my alpha sat, I laid on my side, and he pulled up my shirt a bit. He took the bandage off, and he and Phil inspected the damage. Not too bad, Ryan stated, but I still frowned. Vampires and werewolves heal very quickly. Yes, this was a very deep wound. But why did it just start bleeding from me turning over? I huffed, and he chuckled as he started to clean it. The others are here, Phil stated, and I turned my head to look at him. I noticed he was in clean clothes, and I could smell the hotel soap on him. My heart fluttered a bit, still in awe of that amazing feeling. How many? I asked. He smiled. They're packed in there like sardines. I looked around the room, and Ryan shook his head. You needed your rest. Great, so everyone had crammed into the other room, and I had this one all to myself? That wasn't right. You could have woke me up, I tried. There isn't a wolf in there that would dare, Ryan smiled, and then chuckled when Phil gave a low growl. All done, our alpha stated, and I pulled my shirt down and sat up. 3 of the elders are here, Phil explained. Track's dad and my parents are here. He seemed a little embarrassed about the last part. Reina, came a voice that made my eyes widen. Sally? I gasped and looked towards the door. Track's mother stepped through. Her smile lit up the whole room. She looked at Ryan, and when he nodded, she rushed over. He stood, and she took his place, throwing her arms around me and hugging me tightly. I smiled and hugged her back just as hard. She was like a surrogate mother to me, and I didn't realize how much I missed her until now. She stroked my hair, and I think I heard a muffled cry. I'm fine, I whispered. She sat up, her eyes moist, and shook her head. Oh, my dear girl, you are more than fine. I giggled, and she bit her lower lip, still smiling. Ethy sends her love, although she was furious that she wasn't allowed to come with. I missed Track's little sister, the only girl in a family of 4 boys. She was the youngest, but she kept them all in line. I smiled, and Sally nodded. Are you hungry, dear? That's something a werewolf mother said a lot, mainly because werewolves eat a lot, but vampires, well, they don't eat at all. Blood is the only requirement we needed. On 2 legs, I didn't eat food. I had the special thermos that kept my meals at the right temperature, since I was more sensitive to that than most vampires. It was a different story when I shifted. In wolf form, I think I could probably out-eat any of them. Her eyes widened as she seemed to realize the same thing. Oh, do you need your... No, I'm fine, I interrupted, smiling. It always made me uncomfortable to talk about it around the pack, although I wasn't sure exactly why. Even when I went to Polson, the pack's town, Track was the only one there that ever saw me drink. He would always take me off to the side and let me have my privacy. Sally looked down and gasped, seeing the blood on my shirt. They just changed the bandage, I explained, and she nodded, frowning. Well then, you need to get into some clean clothes. Her eyes moved to Phil, and he stood. I think that's my cue. He kissed the top of my head, smiled at me, and then left, this time closing the door behind him. Would you like to take a shower? She asked as I got out of bed. I shrugged. I took one right before I went to sleep. Then I glanced at the door. Besides, I think they've probably been waiting a long time. Let them wait, she huffed, walking over and standing beside me as I pulled some clothes out of a duffel bag. I smiled, enjoying her mothering me. I never knew my own mother. She died right after I was born. Sally was the closest thing to a mother I ever had, and she was amazing. How long did I sleep? Just as long as you needed to, she said, walking into the bathroom. I heard the water running and quickly pulled off my shirt and yanked the clean one on. I was slipping into my jeans when she came out and handed me a washcloth. I ran it over my face, and then she handed me a brush. Wow, did I look that bad? I didn't wear makeup and hated to dress up, but I did take hygiene seriously. Once I had finished, she took them both back into the bathroom. I waited. When she came back out, she was smiling. So, would you like to sit and talk for a bit? My brows rose, and I looked back at the closed door. She huffed and swatted her hands towards it. They will sit tight until you are ready. I bit my lower lip. What exactly was waiting for me on the other side of that door? Just then there was a knock on it, and she looked at me. I walked over and opened it. Might as well get this all over with now. Phil stood there and I smiled, my heartbeat picking up a bit. He was so handsome. His brown eyes sparkled, but had a strength that I locked onto. His hair was stylish tossed, and his square jaw made him look gorgeous and rough at the same time. "If you need more time," he stated, and my brows wrinkled. What exactly was going to happen once I stepped through that doorway? I turned and looked back at Sally, who was right behind me now. She lifted her chin a bit. I told her we could sit in here and chat as long as she wanted to. Phil nodded and looked back at me, waiting. "What's going to happen when I go in there?" I whispered. "They're going to stare a lot, smile a lot, pace a lot, and ask a lot of questions," he chuckled, "even though I can't imagine there could be any they haven't already thrown at me." "I'm sure they will find more," Sally growled a bit. Phil's body blocked most of the other room from my view, but I also wasn't trying to see around him. I kept my eyes on him. Part of me wanted to fall into his arms right now, but for some reason, the threshold at my feet seemed to warn me to stay on this side. I tilted my head. Why are they doing this? Phil's smile returned and he leaned forward, resting one hand on the door jamb. Eay-o-tay. Another time I would have blushed if I could. Gads, these people, pack or not, were going to interrogate me over my love life? Now, pack members were usually extremely open with each other, but really? Sally put her hand on my shoulder. "Men just have no understanding. There are just some things you don't ask," she huffed again, and I kept my eye on Phil. What had they put him through while I was sleeping peacefully? He winked. "Don't worry. They'll tone it down a notch for you, I think." My eyes widened and then Track's face appeared at Phil's side. "So, are we going to stand in the doorway all day?" "Day?" I gasped, and he nodded. "Yep. You slept forever, wolf girl. It's 10 o'clock a.m. The math ran through my mind quickly. I had gone to sleep at 6 p.m. I slept 18 hours? "That you did," he replied, then turned back into the room, keeping his body in the doorway. "She's still deciding whether to come in here and to be put on display by all you." "Trent Bandel," Sally shot out a warning over my shoulder. He turned back and smiled at his mother. "What?" "I was going to say by all you very respected elders and pack members. Sheesh, Mom, you have no faith in your own son." I giggled, and Sally stepped in front of me, almost wedging herself between Phil and I. "I know my son only too well," she said in a hard but loving voice. Then she glanced back over her shoulder. "Now you tell them that Reina will stay in here until she is good and ready." "It's okay," I said, loving her for wanting to protect me. She frowned, giving me a look that told me I didn't have to do this. When I smiled and nodded, she moved back into my room. Phil and Track parted, and I stepped over that metal runner that separated the rooms. Packed wasn't the word. There were so many people in there that the heat from it was a bit staggering. I stopped just inside, and Phil stepped up behind me, reaching down with one hand and taking mine. Rock, Jackson, Marcus, and Ryan were here. Brian smiled at me, and I returned the gesture. So many people in this little room, and all of them were watching me. Suddenly, I wished I had taken Sally's advice and stayed where I was. The elders were watching me as if I were something that stepped out of a book, or, more likely, something they wanted to press between the pages to preserve. One of them even had a pad of paper and a pen, and was scribbling madly on it. I groaned. Then an older couple stepped out from behind the others and walked towards us. Their faces were a bit familiar, and when I inhaled them, they smelled like pack. Phil leaned over my shoulder. Reina, this is my mom and dad. Natalie and Aaron Ashter. Ashter? So that was Phil's last name. I had never known what it was. I did recognize his parents, but only from gatherings. I hadn't spent much time with either of them. His mother was at least 4 inches shorter than I was, but you could tell she was not one to mess with when pushed. Her dark brown hair, coupled with her husband's blonde hair, was the obvious reason for Phil's coloring, and I quickly realized where he got his beautiful dark brown eyes. They made a strange but cute couple. His father stood at least 6'5", and her petite frame would have been completely lost if he stood in front of her. I smiled at them, seeing Phil's features in each one. His dad's square chin, her brown eyes and dimple. These were definitely his parents. Natalie smiled wider, stepping up and hugging me tightly. Watch out for her side, Phil stated quickly but calmly. His mother softened the hug, but held on for a few seconds more before standing back, still smiling. His dad chuckled and stepped around his wife, where he had to lean down a bit to give me a gentle hug. When he stepped back, Sally moved in. Why don't we let them sit down? She looked around the room. This place is so crowded. I'm sure it will make her uncomfortable. My brows rose and my eyes quickly searched for Track. He was standing there, watching me, and gave me a small nod of support. He knew his mom was right. I wasn't claustrophobic by any means, but this, I wanted to groan, but bit my tongue. Ryan looked around. Jackson, Rock, Track, Marcus, and Brian, you 5 go in the other room. When they stiffened, he gave a soft, low growl that got them moving. They all walked slowly towards the door, and Phil took my hand and moved me out of the way. Track winked at me as they walked through, and I smiled back. The room was a little less crowded now, but Phil's parents still stood in front of us, smiling. I balked a little, and Sally took my other hand and moved me across to one of the beds and had me sit on the edge. Phil sat next to me on one side, and she plopped down on the other. I smiled at her, and she nodded. She was going to play Mama Wolf, and I was glad. The elders brought their chairs over, and for the next hour, I answered their questions about what happened, from my perspective. When they pushed too far, Phil, Sally, or Natalie jumped in, and Ryan didn't stop them. Our pack alpha didn't seem to like what was happening either. He paced what little he could in the small space and kept his eyes on us. The elders were not higher than him, but they were the elders, the oldest wolves in the pack, and because of that, they were respected. They were also the ones responsible for keeping up the pack history, which is probably why Elder John was scribbling away on his notepad the whole time. That's all there is, Phil finally snapped, my hand tight in his on his leg. You have asked us hundreds of questions 12 different ways, he stated, his voice tight now. Phil was an alpha in his own right. He was my clique alpha. Polson had a large enough population that we were broken down into smaller sets called cliques. Besides his parents, only the older clique alphas and Ryan were above him in rank. Phil was used to being in charge, and this was making him edgy. I could feel his irritation, and I also knew he didn't like what they were doing to me. I gave his hand a supportive squeeze, and he squared his shoulders, standing up. I stayed on the bed, but our hands were still interlocked, a united front. We are done here, he stated again, And this time Ryan stepped up. He didn't say anything, but his body language said he agreed. Finally, the older wolves nodded, Elder John still writing like a madman. They stood as well and moved their chairs back to the small table. The others were standing around the room, watching and listening quietly. How humiliating. Sally smiled at me, her eyes saying she was proud of Phil for what he did. I had to agree. Then she stood up. Well, I think we should see about getting some food. I'm sure everyone is hungry. I chuckled. That was Sally. Natalie walked over and also smiled at her son with pride. He winked at his mother and then turned to me. When I stood, he turned from the others. How are you doing? I could use some fresh air and a walk, I admitted. Unfortunately, it's daylight outside, he said, and I nodded. Sadly, that was the one thing I couldn't recover from so easily. Sunlight would kill a vampire. Slowly, but the end result was final. Well, she needs to get out of here. This place is too small, and too... Sally looked around and huffed. Hotelish. I giggled then, and so did she. Ryan sighed, and then an odd hush fell over the room. I frowned and wondered why that comment had silenced everyone. My head tilted to one side as I tried to piece it together. Natalie walked over and smiled at me. Well then, we'll just have to find something more suitable, won't we? Something with a pool would be great, came Track's voice from the other room. An indoor pool, Jackson added, and I laughed. Ryan smiled at me and I shrugged. It would be nice. Consider it done, Aaron stated, and his wife nodded. We'll get you out of this cramped little place as soon as the sun goes down. She smiled and opened her mouth to say something else, but her husband cleared his throat. I frowned. Why was everyone being so careful with what they said? Then Track poked his head into the room. Are we going to get some food or what? Ryan walked over, picking up his cell phone and tossed it to Track. Since you're so eager, call in the order. Make it for pickup, then you and Rock can go get it. Track frowned, looking at me, and Ryan sighed. Fine. Rock and Marcus can go get it. There was grumbling from the room behind Track until Ryan's low growls silenced it. What exactly was going on? Why didn't Track want to leave? I certainly wasn't in any danger here, with 2 rooms full of pack wolves. My brows wrinkled and I looked at the faces in the room. What were they not saying? It was written on all of them, something they were all thinking but didn't want me to know about. My forehead bunched up more and I jumped a bit when Track's dad, David, stepped into my line of view. He smiled at me and then turned and looked at Phil. Am I dying? I asked and then flinched when I realized I said it out loud. The talking in the room stopped, and so did the movement. I felt a strange squeeze in my stomach as their eyes focused on me. I swallowed hard, waiting for someone to be brave enough to spit out whatever my terminal diagnosis must be. You're not dying, Sally smiled, putting a hand on my shoulder. Other than that little scratch on your side, you are very healthy. A wave of relief flooded through me. Then, why is everyone being so careful around me? I saw her smile catch, just for a split second, and something flashed in her eyes. But she recovered quickly and smiled at me. Reina, what you and Phil have experienced? What you have? Well, dear, we are all watching a legend come to life. Then her smile did fall and she wrinkled her forehead. Some just forget their manners under those conditions. She shot the elders a hard stare and then looked back at me. That did make some sense, but why be careful with what they said? Everyone seemed a little lost for words, except during the interrogation. Track walked into the room then, handing Ryan back the phone. He glanced around the room slowly and then looked at me. Always causing a ruckus. My head tilted. Ruckus? I smiled, and he rolled his eyes. So anyhow, I think we ordered enough for everyone, he stated, and Ryan nodded. I gasped then, and again, the room seemed to be put on pause. The tingle in my legs came on fast. When that happened, it was usually too late to stop it. Phil turned to me and Track was in my face. She's gonna shift, my best friend explained. Elder John was on his feet. She should not, he snapped, causing us all to turn and look at him. The pain shot harder, moving upwards, and I moaned. Well, she can't control it very well yet. Stress makes it harder, and you have her maxed out on that count, Track shot back. You might want to make note of that on your pad there, he growled, gesturing with his chin towards the table, now filled with large yellow notepads. This time, Sally didn't reprimand her son. I groaned and looked at him, my eyes telling him I couldn't stop it now. Let's get her into the other room, he hissed, as Elder John went into another writing frenzy. Phil nodded and took my hand. We will go as well, Elder Michael stated. No, you won't, Ryan stated in a hard, firm voice and stepped up between me and them. My knees went out, and Phil scooped me up before I could hit the floor. Phil and Track will see to her. Everyone else will stay here, the Alpha said, letting his voice vibrate in the way only an Alpha could. The guys in the other room rushed up, but when Track told them I needed to shift, they nodded and left quickly, shutting the door behind them. Phil laid me on the bed, and Track started to take my clothes off. I can manage, I grunted. Instead of coming back with a sarcastic remark, he nodded. They both stood and turned their backs to give me my privacy, while I nearly ripped my clothes off. I had seen them all naked before after a shift. There was nothing sexual about it. It was a werewolf thing, period. But female werewolves were rare, and we were given special privileges and pampered by the pack. Probably to make up for the fact that we were treated like glass and were constantly hovered over and watched. Out of love, but still, it was definitely over the top. Then the pain hit, ripping through me like white-hot fire, and I screamed. Bones snapped and then started to realign. Just when it reached the worst part, the part where you're halfway between forms, where you're begging for death to claim you, I felt something. The pain eased just a bit, and I smiled. It was Phil. Somehow he was connected to me and was going to help me through it. It was as if he was inside my mind with me, holding me while my body completed the torturous transformation. It only took a half a minute now, but 30 seconds is an extremely long time to be tortured by your own body. A warmth washed over me, and I actually felt him there with me, helping to make it less painful somehow. Tears fell, but they were tears that had nothing to do with the pain. The sensation was again beyond words. The love that it took to share this kind of pain, to take part of it so that the other person didn't have to hurt as much, was staggering. Many people claim they wish that they could do that, but if any one of them had ever shifted, they might change their mind. I felt him wrap around me, protecting me as my body was put back together. I smiled and rubbed up against the sensation. I could smell him, not just with my nose, but it was as if his scent was inside of me, rushing through my veins, helping to pump my heart. I moaned softly and then gasped and shivered as the shifting ended and the sensation left with it. When I opened my wolf eyes, I saw Phil. He was sitting on the bed, smiling down at me. For a split second, he looked almost surreal, but then he came into focus, and I gave a happy bark. Something caught my eye, and I turned to track. He sat with his eyes wide and his mouth open, and he was looking at Phil. I barked at him, and he blinked, closed his mouth, and turned to me. I barked again, and Phil held up a hand. "Stay still for a second, Reina. The bandage came off." He leaned over my side, and I turned my head. If I kept this up, I was never going to heal. Track shook his head. "How did you do that?" he whispered, his voice deep with awe. Our clique alpha shrugged. "I don't know. I just couldn't let her hurt like that." He stood up and grabbed the medical bag. Track swallowed hard, and Phil eyed him. "How do you know what happened?" "I have no idea," Track stated, giving a nervous chuckle. "Something just seemed... It was freaky, but in a cool way." I tilted my head, and Phil smiled at him. "If you tell me I started to glow, I'll knock you off this bed." Track shrugged. "No, but I could just tell." Then he looked at me, and she stopped panting and screaming, and her face looked almost calm. "Man, wow." He ran one hand through his dark hair. "This is really... this... wow," he finally sighed, and I chuckled inside. Track? Speechless? I thought so he could hear me. Someone better write that down. Phil smiled. "Don't say that too loud. Elder John might hear you." Track and I both snapped our heads to look at him. "You can hear me?" I asked. When he nodded, I looked at Track. "But you're the only one that can hear me when I shift." That made the two of them exchange an odd look, but Phil turned and smiled at me. "We're bonded now." "Do all bonded wolves, can they hear each other?" I stuttered. "Not when they are on 2 feet, and not when only one is shifted," Phil stated as he bandaged my side. "There are feelings or sensation, and then there is the pack connection, which allows us to communicate when we're all shifted, through sensations, pictures, feelings, but not like this." "But you can actually hear me talking or thinking?" He nodded, and Track chuckled and ran a hand through his hair again, the look of amazement still plain on his face. "Well, at least now you aren't stuck being my only translator," I said with a playful bark in his direction. Again they both looked at each other, their eyes having one of those private conversations. "Why do you two keep doing that?" I growled. Track seemed to regain himself and grinned at me. "To annoy you," he chuckled, and I playfully nipped his arm. And that's where I'm going to stop.